Welcome everyone to the first of our 6 conversations. The 2 people who will be involved in the inaugural conversation are Brian Baer and Michelle Woods, whom I will very, very briefly introduce. Brian Baer is Professor of Russian and Translation Studies at Kent State University and a leading research fellow at the National Research University Higher Education School of Economics in Moscow. He's the founding editor of the journal Translation and Interpreting Studies and co-editor of the Bloomsbury book series Literatures, Cultures and Translation. His publications include the monographs Other Russians, Homosexuality and the Crisis of Post-Soviet Identity, Translation and the Making of Modern Russian Literature, and one of my favorites, Queer Theory and Translation Studies, Languages, Politics, Desire, as well as the collected volumes Beyond the Ivory Tower, Rethinking Translation Pedagogy, along with Jeffrey Kobe, and Researching Translation and Interpreting, co-authored with Claudia Angelelli, Translation in Russian Contexts with Susanna Witt, and Queering Translation, Translating the Queer with Klaus Kindl. His most recent translations include Culture, Memory and History, Essays in Cultural Semiotics by Yuri Lotman, Introduction to Translation Theory by Andrei Fyodorov, and the novel Red Crosses by the Belarusian writer Sasha Filipenko. He is the current president of the American Translation and Interpreting Studies Association. In conversation with Brian, we have Michelle Woods, who is Associate Professor of English at SUNY New Paltz. She's the author of Kafka Translated, How Translators Have Shaped Our Readings of Kafka, Censoring Translation, Censorship Theatre and the Politics of Translation, and Translating Milan Kundera. She's the editor of a book of essays on literature and translation entitled Authorizing Translation, is co-editing a forthcoming book entitled Teaching Literature in Translation, and writing a book about the female translators of Anna Karenina entitled Reading Anna. She is co-editor of the book series for Bloomsbury, Literatures, Cultures, Translation, along with Brian Baer, and her translations have appeared in Granta and Words Without Borders. I think we're very, very privileged to be privy to their conversation, which, as far as dialogues go, is a fairly intimate exchange between 2 people. So I would like to welcome Brian Baer and Michelle Woods to begin their conversation.
Welcome, everyone. I guess I'd like to start because what I thought when we talked about this idea of re-envisioning translation, one of the first things that came into my head was an article that Brian Baer published last year in the Translator 25th anniversary issue, called On Origins, the Myth History of Translation Studies and the Geo-politics of Knowledge. And it was really a kind of rethinking of how we might talk about the history of translation theory and translation studies as a field. And a very timely one, given the conversation and the idea of the conference, the colloquium today and tomorrow. And I guess I want to introduce it slightly by saying that I think it's really timely, and it's kind of what we're thinking about, right? To rethinking about this idea, re-envisioning these ideas. But also, you know, like many scholars of our generation, mine and Brian's generation, we often came from other fields because translation studies was really just gaining a foothold as an independent field. And, you know, it came kind of from Slavic studies, comp lit, English literature. And what struck me when I began moving into translation studies was how obsessed translation studies was by its origin story. Now, the truth is, of course, with comp lit, Slavic studies, English lit, they kind of elide their histories and pretend that they were always there. You know, it's kind of a different strategy. But it really interested me, this idea that we kept bringing up the question of where we started, where we came from, and repeating and reiterating the same history. So with that, I guess I have questions for Brian about the article, and the beginning is really this word in the title of the article, myth history. And I'd like you to, if you wouldn't mind, kind of to explain what you mean by that, and yeah, kind of elucidate this kind of idea that you've brought to rethinking and re-envisioning translation theory and history.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm very conscious of being a kind of 2nd generation translation scholar, one generation down from the founding figures of our field who played such an enormous role in bringing attention to translation across the humanities. But the history that we're talking about, if you'll indulge me, I want to just remind people of the contours of that history. And I thought I would read what is perhaps the most succinct, the most rhetorically compelling, and the most authoritative version. And that's the one offered by James Holmes. And authoritative, of course, in the sense that James Holmes is often described as a founder, if not the founder of the field, thanks to his conceptual mapping, the fact that he gives English name translation studies. And it's a sentence long, but it captures all of the dynamics of this history. He writes, after centuries of incidental and desultory attention from a scattering of authors, philologians, and literary scholars, plus here and there a theologian or an idiosyncratic linguist, the subject of translation has enjoyed a marked and constant increase in interest on the part of scholars in recent years, with the Second World War as a kind of turning point. We often talk about the turns in translation studies. It turns out we began with a turn, which is interesting. And again, there's a lot to be unpacked with that. But so I, again, grew up with this story. I circulated it, questioning, taught it in my classes. I cited it where in my work. But as I continued working in Soviet translation theory, and especially working in the pre-war decades from in the 1920s and 30s, I started to realize that this narrative didn't fit the Soviet context. There is no way that the work from the 20s and 30s could be described as incidental and desultory. And so there was no way that the Second World War was some kind of radical turning point. In many ways, it was a continuation of a tradition, the foundations of which were firmly laid in the 20s and 30s. In fact, the Soviets had dismissed formal equivalence in the 20s. By the late 20s, they'd already expanded translation theory to include non-literary texts in Alexander Finkel's Theory and Practice of Translation of 1929. He even has subcategories of what he calls administrative or business style, journalistic writing, and what they call socio-political writing. They had instituted university programs in the early 30s, and they began to generate very serious pedagogical materials in the 30s related to the teaching of scientific and technical translation. And again, by some of the leading, like Fyodorov, Morozov, and Retsker. So the tradition didn't fit that narrative. So it was the first moment where I started to provincialize this Western narrative of the field as a very specifically Western story. And so I came up with this term, I happened upon this term myth history in the translator's introduction, I guess appropriately enough, to the Mayan sacred text, Popol Vuh, in which the English translator David Tedlock refers to it as a myth history, which he glosses, the function of which he glosses as not to shore up what Westerners define as historical truth, but to supply a foundational narrative that helps a group of people form a collective identity. So I began to appreciate that this was more or less the function of that myth history of translation studies, but it also led me to try to get at the origins of this origin story. And it turned out it was, as they say, turtles all the way down. There was no definitive history study that had established the facts of this history. And so then I started to question the history in a different way, thanks again to the Soviets, because they were citing Western scholars that I'd never heard of. So in the 20s and 30s, they're citing Western scholarship that had been kind of written off or consigned to the dustbin of history by this myth history of the field, people writing in the late 19th, early 20th century, and so on. So then I started to do the work and started to explore these figures. Was indeed their work incidental and desultory and so on? And what it turned out is that it wasn't so much, as I'm trying to develop now, so much a narrative of there was nothing and then there was suddenly serious sustained work, but rather that the work that happened, that came out from about 1850 to the Second World War, almost without exception, framed translation as an art. So this is across the European languages, Искусство перевода in Russian, Die Kunst des Übersetzens in German, L'art de traduire, art of translation, etc. So what happens in the post-war Cold War period is a reframing of translation, associating it with science and technology. So this is a somewhat different story. And certainly I found in looking at some of these early texts, they are not anecdotal. Some of them, and especially I became fascinated with one because he was so widely cited by the Soviets, Paul. His work, Die Kunst des Übersetzens from 1894, went through 4 editions before the First World War. He divides the work. It's about translating the classics, but he divides it into 3 categories. I think he's got synonymy, word order, and syntax. So he, certainly foreshadows the linguistic approaches and stylistics-based approaches of later work. But also curious is that he prominently uses in the title of his introduction and in the title of his afterword, the word Aufgabe, which of course many people know from Walter Benjamin's 1923 essay, The Task of the Translator. And then in the conclusion, he actually uses the word Die Fortleben der Aufgabe, or the continuation. And Fortleben is used many times, I think 4 times in Benjamin's essay, as well as Überleben, afterlife, once. So it started to make me think, oh, we always present Benjamin as kind of this voice in the desert, this, light in the darkness of the pre-war writings on translation, but we might now inscribe him in more contemporary German discourse on translation. And it's quite probable that he encountered Kauer's work when he was in Berlin in the pre-World War I period. So again, I started to rethink this whole thing, the effects of the Cold War on our notion of translation and translation.
Brian seems to have
Positivism
frozen.
into our
I'm sorry to interrupt
thought,
you.
and so a different way to look at the field.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Brian, but you froze for a while there. I think we missed the last bit of your comment. If I could just very quickly take advantage of the fact that I'm back online to remind all of our attendees that you can ask questions during the conversation as well. Actually, we would invite you to ask questions as they come up to you. Okay. Sorry, Brian, for the interruption.
Yeah, sorry.
Hope you don't freeze again. Okay. Bye-bye.
So I guess just 2 big takeaways from this exploration I've been doing is number one, that history had kind of placed the history of translation thought in this little box and tied it up with a ribbon. And I'm trying to open the box, and I would encourage young scholars and doctoral students to go back and look at these works. There's a lot of interesting work to be done. And especially in the Cold War, which again, I don't see it as Maria Tomoshko does as a time when we started going beyond positivism. I see it as a time when positivism was injected into translation. And so you get this reframing of translation as a science, culminating, of course, in 1964, Eugene Nida's The Science of Translation. And then in 1966, we get the Automated Language Processing Advisory Committee report that says that machine translation has basically hit a wall. And it's not long after that that we get what Steiner calls the hermeneutic turn and the discovery, or as he says, the rediscovery of Benjamin's essay, The Task of the Translator, from 1923. So the first English translation occurs in 1968. The first French translation in 1971. So the second takeaway from all this for me is the huge importance of translation, of interlinear translation, of scholarship in changing or affecting the geopolitics of knowledge. Because when there are no translations for whatever reason, the Soviets weren't translated because of Cold War politics, let's say, once there's that gap, it's very hard to go back and argue that those works are relevant. And once we don't have those translations, then we start to anthologize the field and they don't appear in the anthologies. So we've institutionalized that gap, very specific history of the field. So sorry, that's my long answer.
No, I'm really interested because you talk, and I want to come back to this, about this idea of World War II being this initial turn, really, you know, and it's kind of got this mythic idea that you know, that, yeah, again, that was the cutoff between maybe this conception of translation as art and then translation as science, but also that it's connected to a kind of neo-colonial and neoliberal ideology. And this morning, and I want to get you to talk a bit more about that. But this morning when I was rereading your article, it really struck me that actually when translation studies took off in the 90s, you know, there was this kind of, as a kind of the contemporary field that we know it, really from, say, rethinking, Venuti's Rethinking Translation 92, that was the end of the Cold War, that 1989 was the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama said. And there was this kind of sense that neoliberalism had won, the West had won, it had beaten the East, and so on. And so it took these ideas of, you talk about the idea of the dominance of the global North after World War II, and this kind of, you talk about the grammar of the universal grammar of human rights, which in fact isn't universal at all. It's this kind of idea that the West won World War II, and it's going to establish the norms and practices of you know, thought in post-World War II Europe. But I wonder too, if you thought about this idea that 1989 was a pivotal year for translation studies in some senses, that as it took off in the 90s, we were in this kind of valedictory moment, you know, and I think Siri mentioned this in her introduction, this whole idea of a teleology, you know, that we're going from, or this evolutionist kind of concept that we're going from a pre-time, but we're really thinking of it in what you use Apodaria's term Eurochronology, that we're going somewhere. And we've always had this very kind of teleological sense in translation studies, where, you know, we started off as nothing, but we're going forward and we keep having these turns and we're progressing towards something. But you know, I'd like you to talk maybe about this idea of how it adopted this progressivist kind of rhetoric of post-World War II Europe, and how that inculcates translation studies in some ways with a kind of neo-colonialism, an ignorance of the global South and so on, and the other Europe. And maybe I don't know if you've thought about it, but this idea of 1989 too being a kind of a moment that affected how the 90s and 2000s kind of translation study saw itself.
Right. Yeah, that's a big question. So, I mean, one of the ways in which the narrative is Western, it's not simply progressivist, but it's this kind of Kantian emancipation narrative, right? And specifically, you see in it this notion of Bildung, which is so important, that we start off immature and then we grow into our own self-sufficient, mature field that can compete with other fields. So it's very Kantian, it's very Bildung related. And, you know, my argument has always been, and I tried to develop this in my work on the translation, English translation of Charlotte von Mausdorff's memoir after the fall of communism and during the so-called transition period, that you know, she was appropriated into this narrative, which she resisted. If you look at her memoir, she resisted from the start, because she begins her memoir with the attack on her hotel by neo-Nazi skinheads. This was in 1992. So how prescient she was that the biggest challenge we'd face in the post-communist era was the rise of neo-fascism and the rise of ethno-nationalism. But we couldn't hear that because we were so intent on packaging her in this celebratory emancipation narrative, right, that now we have incorporated. And there was a beautiful quote from a East German school teacher related to this project where they had collected all these home movies from East Germany to try to give us a different notion of what life was like there, because we have these, you know, very stereotypical notions of it, like a giant prison or bleak and so on. And the teacher says, you know, we thought when communism fell that we had something to offer the West, and instead we were just appropriated. So I think that was a moment of reckoning that we failed to take advantage of by declaring victory. I mean, if you think that we were engaged in, the West was engaged in a mutually defining relationship with the Soviet Union for so many years, the fall of communism should have led us to rethink who we are, right? Not just claim victory that we don't have to change. And in fact, that's why I'm so fascinated by the Cold War and its disturbing afterlife in the United States right now, where you have all these Republicans talking about Marxism and socialism invading, and where Donald Trump could use the word enemy of the people, which was this grotesque Stalinist legal term that was used to basically arrest anyone on any charge. And in fact, it was so odious from a legal standpoint that Khrushchev rejected it after he took over from Stalin. So to have that uttered by an American president, it can only happen through complete historical amnesia. But again, we didn't reckon with the Cold War legacy and the fact that in many ways, we aped the Soviet Union by, we had this McCarthy show trials, which is the closest thing we ever got to a Stalinist show trial. And in both places, the Soviet Union and the United States, people had great hopes that there would be greater freedom after the defeat of fascism. And it didn't happen in either place. In the Soviet Union, you got the campaign against cosmopolitanism, which was brutal and very anti-Semitic. And in the United States, you got both the communist Red Scare and the Lavender Scare that led to thousands of homosexuals being fired from the State Department for no other reason than the fact that they were homosexual, and that had been determined by the FBI spying on them. So, and of course, Black Americans who served in the war and thought they were coming back to a freer America found that wasn't the case either. So again, it's time to question those emancipation narratives. I don't think they're helpful, and especially because we're still grappling with the legacy of the Cold War. And yeah, so.
And how that feeds into translation, how we see translation history as well, because we do have this emancipatory narrative too, right? That we're, and a utopian narrative when it comes to translation, right? That we're taking this elided history, it's a way of communicating and kind of, I wonder how you think about how that all fits into how we've packaged translation theory history.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the importance too of understanding that translation is, as Vincente Raphael says, a technique. Yuri Lotman would say, a mechanism. It is neutral in the sense that it can be either used for any purposes, but nonetheless, it does unique cultural work that maybe is distinct from original writing. And I think that's our task to explore. But yes, as Mona Baker likes to say, sure, translation can be a bridge, but invading armies often also use bridges. So it's not only about hospitality, it's about appropriation and everything else. So to explore translation in all its complexity. And the Cold War, though, also was an interesting time for translation in that translation assumed symbolic resonance. So the Soviets, was very common in the post-war period to quote the number of translations, the number of authors, and the size of the print runs to show how internationalist the Soviet state was. And you saw that too in the West in those early internationalist years. I found a book review by W.H. Auden about a collection of translations of Greek poetry. And he said at the end, it wasn't a very favorable review, but at the end he says, every translator is an international ambassador of goodwill. So again, the Cold War shaped in a lot of ways our understanding of translation. And that's why I think some of the most interesting work done now on that period is through the archive. And so Andrew Rubin's work, Archives of Authority, I've directed 2 dissertations on the Franklin Book Project, these government-sponsored translation programs where the government had to hide its influence because it was meant to be propaganda that doesn't look like propaganda, right? In a way to promote the kind of post-war imperialism that couldn't look like imperialism in a decolonizing world. So the archives have been hugely, I think, important, and that's why I'm so happy that this Nida library is going to be housed at the Fondazione his papers are going to be, I think, to rethink some of this Cold War history that we thought we knew.
Right, and to think about that idea of decolonizing, literary studies and translation studies, and we've had a number of books which have talked about post-colonial translation theory and decolonizing our conception of translation history and translation theory. But you're very interesting in this article because you're kind of saying, yeah, at one point we talk about that and we say that we need to do this, but at the same time, we're also repeating this myth that actually translation studies began in Europe, and we're worlding translation theory as we look to literatures and cultures, beyond Europe. We're just repeating this kind of European origin myth. And I wondered if you want to talk about that, certainly the way that it's kind of repeated through the publication of handbooks and anthologies and so on, how we're reifying this idea in some ways.
Right. So, I mean, the more people, and there have been repeated calls for more attention to be paid to Soviet translation theory. And I intentionally use Soviet because much of the work done in the 20s and 30s was done not only in Russian, but also the Ukrainian scholars were doing fascinating work in the 20s and 30s, like Alexander Finkel and Volodymyr Derzhavin, really sophisticated, and they were reading each other. So the Russians were citing the Ukrainians immediately after publication, vice versa. But then, so people started to then feel that they needed to justify this erasure of the Soviet tradition. And I started to look at how people wrote it off, right? Because how could we have ignored this? How could we have not translated any of this stuff? And I found a very interesting statement by Dirk Della Battista in a 2018 handbook, where he says, Marxist approaches in countries under communist regimes among those new forms of literary research that arose from 1914 onwards, sometimes exercising a nearly absolute rule, but without ever making much of a difference in the widespread neglect of literary translation, which floored me because, of course, this Principles of Literary Translation from 1919, which came out of the publishing house World Literature, which was founded by Maxim Gorky and Alexander Lunacharsky, was considered by Andrei Fyodorov to be the first modern work of translation theory. And they had very ambitious plans of translating all the great works of world literature in high quality translations with scholarly introductions and so forth. But even on a deeper level, the Marxist influence was very productive in the 20s and 30s because this materialist approach to language gave Soviet linguistics and by extension Soviet translation studies a kind of sociolinguistics turn already in the 20s. So a through line between the translation scholars like Fyodorov, who studied under the formalists, and Mikhail Bakhtin, who was a critic of the formalists, but they both shared this appreciation of what Bakhtin called the life of language, and specifically the social life of words. And the translation theorists like Fyodorov and like Rosalia Shor discuss this in particular. So I found that the Marxist influence was in fact quite productive. So all these reductive Cold War notions about communism and other things to justify the erasure of this tradition, struck me as not helpful.
Well, I thought it's interesting because you bring up this idea of rhizomatic history, actually, which I think was Siri mentioned that, I think in 2011, it maybe came from her original article. And I thought that was really interesting, right? This idea that we don't have to have this unitary history of, where does contemporary modern translation studies come from, but that we can look at all these kind of, these what was happening diachronically in places. What was there, in fact, as you kind of mentioned, any kind of cross-pollinization, from Germany to Russia and so on, that we've missed, and I think that's really interesting. And I think also it's interesting in the Soviet and anyone who hasn't read the article, it's a really fascinating case study because it is this history that's essentially been erased in translation studies, and yet from right after the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, they're thinking about translation and setting up world literature and immediately writing these theoretical texts, and how that feeds in then to the formalists and Bakhtin, which have become so influential in literary studies, and yet they've been kind of taken out of context, taken out of their own own kind of material context. And that kind of materialistic thinking, materialism and Marxism, that's kind of okay because it's Bakhtin and Shklovsky and so on. And yet this kind of, at the same time, elision of the translation theory that was going on at the same time, I think is really interesting. But I wonder if you want to talk a bit more about this idea of rhizomatic, or this idea of trying to get away from this kind of unitary idea of where we came from and where we're going. And I think sometimes where we're going is being so obsessed over by translation studies, which is why we're obsessed by turns, right? We're constantly, what's next, what's next, what's next? And I wonder actually if you want to critique the idea of turns or not, whether you think they're good things, or whether that's too caught into this idea that we're just moving on ahead, this Kantian idea exactly, that we came from immaturity to maturity, and how in some ways more rhizomatic thinking could just open up ideas of how we think about theory and how we think about our own field.
Right. Well, so I was sensitized to a lot of this historiographic critique in translating Yuri Lotman's work on cultural memory. And he said, historians perhaps unavoidably present history as inevitable, right? Because we're looking back on it, and these things which were not at all inevitable are given the air of inevitability. And that's especially true when we have only one story, right? Then it really seems like this is the only confluence of things that could have conspired to produce a sustained and serious study of translation. But once we have an alternative tradition, then we can start seeing, okay, there are other things, the Bolshevik Revolution, the internationalization that communists brought new attention. So we can start to see other possibilities and see that first tradition wasn't inevitable at all. And I'm also a big believer, I think the Italian Renaissance philosopher, art historian Alberti, he said, and I'm sorry if I'm misquoting this, but something like all knowledge comes from comparison. And the idea that you can't know something in itself, right? How would you, you can only know it by comparison with other things. And so I think it's important to abandon the need to have a single origin story and begin to understand, and so then begin to compare and contrast those contexts in which translation is relevant, those contexts in which translation acquires this symbolic value. So, I mean, one of the things that, again, led to me rethinking a lot of the received ideas I had was the article I did, collection on authorizing translation, where I was really curious about where non-translators get their ideas about what translation is. And so I was curious about the state of translation criticism. So I decided to create 3 small corpora of translation reviews, or reviews of translated works from the New York Times for 1900, 1950, and 2000. And again, I guess I thought I would find this increasing sophistication. Not at all. In fact, I was impressed by the 1900 corpus. Again, there weren't as many reviews of translated works, but almost all of them were positive. Almost all of them referred to translation as labor, as a difficult task. And then in the 1950, you got all of this, again, internationalist kind of triumphalism. And then by 2000s, you got a lot of melancholy about the possibility of translation. So I think, the whole idea of untranslatability didn't come out of anywhere. It's maybe a symptom of a larger cultural malaise, which was linked, in my view, to also the Western mourning that the Eastern Europe didn't transition the way it was supposed to, because that's the time I started questioning what happened there. And now you saw the return of authoritarianism, neo-fascism, ethno-nationalism across Europe. So I think there's it just tells me there's a whole lot of very interesting work to be done about our past and translation thought across cultures and times.
And perhaps to speak to that, or connected to that, is this idea of, because I know we've talked a lot about, and I know it's a really interest of yours in the translation of translation theory, because it's something that that seems to be another hole and another point of research, I think, for younger scholars. This idea of, what's out there in terms of writing in languages that because I was struck by you have a piece where you're talking about the anthologies, say the Routledge Anthology of Translation Theory, Routledge, what is it, Translation Theory? I can't think of the name of it now. And it's gone through various iterations. It's coming out in the 4th edition, which does have more. It's got some Chinese theory and so on. But I was really shocked at how few actual translations, when you pointed it out in your article, there are in this book about translation theory. And that even when it's using Eastern European, Jiří Levy, Nabokov, that their articles, Jakobsen, their articles written in English, so they weren't actually translated. And so I wonder if you want to maybe speak about this disconnect and the possibilities for going ahead with translation theory in how kind of bad, I don't want to use such a value-ridden word, but how tardy we've been in thinking about translating theory to open up this rhizomatic approach. And I wondered if you'd like to speak to that.
Well, so yes, I think having translations is absolutely essential to creating a more sophisticated, nuanced, inclusive understanding of translation, because without the translations, these works end up in the hands of a few specialists. Often what circulates is a very reductive synopsis of the work. This is what happened to Fyodorov's 1953 Introduction to Translation Theory. But there's a lot of work to be done to overcome that. And I think Catherine Porter, when she was the president of MLA, made a call for us to consider translation, or for universities to consider translation scholarship, and to recognize it when we consider promotion and tenure. And I think there's even an ethical responsibility among scholars working in the global North to expend some of their labor on doing this work. And so there's a few glimmers of hope. There's a translation prize, a collaborative translation prize by a US journal, but about East European politics, I think. And they give a collaborative translation prize to a Western scholar who works with the scholar region to translate that scholar's work into English. And I think you and I a few years ago attended the award ceremony, and the description of the award-winning translation was so sophisticated. I mean, it really gave me hope. And also, what allowed me to do the translation of Fyodorov's 1953 Introduction to Translation Theory, which of course publishers were not thrilled about. Why is this work suddenly relevant? But it was awarded the S Translation Prize in 2014. So that prize is hugely important in letting publishers know that there are scholars out there who think these works are valuable. And then the other thing that we can do is make sure as publishers that we have translations reviewed. So for example, in the journal Translation and Interpreting Study, we have a regular feature called Translation Studies in Translation. This last issue, I don't know if it's out yet, it has an article by Alexander Finkel. He probably wrote the first article on self-translation that came out in the 20s. And we send those out for review. And and they both review why they think the work is worthy of translation and the quality of the translation. So I also think if we're able to show our universities, hey, look, I have these peer reviews that talk about the quality of the translation, that's one way we can move forward. And also I'm editing a series with Routledge now called Translation Studies in Translation. And one of the forthcoming works that should be out very soon will be an incredible anthology of Arabic writings in translation, edited by Tarek Shama. I'm very excited about that, because again, without those translations, we rely on often very reductive, paraphrases of a tradition or a work that circulate increasingly in these tertiary sources, these handbooks, encyclopedias, and encyclopedias. And anthologies. So without those translations, we institutionalize those gaps and those erasures.
Right, in some way we're victims of our own success, because I remember when I came to the field in the 90s, there wasn't that much, it was you could put your hands around the kind of researchers, mainly kind of monographs or small, but now this whole idea that a lot of people are coming through tertiary texts, the handbooks, the translation studies reader, I forgot the title of it, and so on. But in fact, it's kind of going back to these kind of, maybe primary texts or secondary texts. That might be the way of doing it and translating.
Well, maybe I can end then with this anecdote, because how exciting looking at these older texts can be. And I should say, I saw Catherine Batchelor gave a talk recently about this article and said it got her to go back and look at some of these early writings, and she was surprised at how sophisticated these were. But several years ago, when I finally got my hands on the actual text of the 1919 Principles of Literary Translation by Kornei Chukovsky and Nikolai Gumilyov, I remember sitting in my office and I started reading it, and I immediately ran across the hallway to my colleague Judy Wakabayashi's office, and I said, I have to read you this first paragraph because it sounds so contemporary. And so I thought maybe if we could end with this. This is from the opening paragraph. Chukovsky writes, "The translator of literary prose does not photograph the original, but creatively recreates it. In order to be a translator, it is not sufficient to know this or that foreign language. The translator is an artist, a master of the word, a co-participant in the creative work of that author whom he is translating. He is the same kind of servant of art as an actor, sculptor, or painter. The text of the original serves as the material for his complex and often inspired creation. The translator is before all else a talent." And so, yes, Judy agreed that it sounded very contemporary, but this notion of a co-creator of meaning, and this was 1919. I mean, the tragedy of it, of course, is that with the rise of Stalinism, they had to back away from some of this, the notion of the liberty of the translator. But yeah, there's some really interesting things, and that alone got me thinking that some of our history doesn't have it. It doesn't capture this.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you very much, Brian. I think Juliana has a whole slew of questions for you, and that should keep us all very busy for the next half hour or so. So here's Juliana.
Okay, thank you. You're back. There are a few questions. There are two which came at the beginning of Brian's conversation, and they are from Yingmei Liu. And the first one is very, very short. Dr. Baer, do you mean that the translation scholars oft-cited by Soviet scholars inspired Benjamin?
Right, no. And also I'm not saying obviously Benjamin necessarily took these notions from Paul Kauer, but certainly there was, in that German cultural sphere, it was common to talk of translation as a task, as an Aufgabe, and even using some of those terms like Fortleben about translation. So again, this idea that that Benjamin was this voice in the desert, I think we might look at him a little differently. Now, it's interesting about Benjamin, because Yves Gambier often asks me, why is it that the Soviet and US or Western traditions kind of diverged in the post-communist era? Why didn't they come together? And it's interesting, they never had a Russian translation, or they didn't have a Russian translation of Benjamin's essay until the 2000s. So the Soviets could not, for I think ideological reasons, take the hermeneutic turn. So in other words, they had to assume that the meaning of the source was evident, was there, and then they had a choice of options on the translator's part. I think that was a necessary position they had to take, and so perhaps they were unable to take the hermeneutic turn as suggested by the non-translation of Benjamin's essay.
Okay, and the second question from the same source is again for Brian. Why were the Soviet translation scholars kind of being neglected in the translation history?
Yes, I think some of it is Cold War politics. Suzanna Yatmarova of Charles University has suggested there was a language barrier. There just wasn't a lot of translators of these Eastern European languages. I don't know, but they were translating a lot of Russian literature. So I don't think that's necessarily the reason. I also think, it's a fact that Western, especially US Anglophone publishers liked dissident writing. So if the person had been imprisoned or with the wrong side of the Soviet state, they often got published and got published very quickly. Many of the theorists that I'm dealing with, like Fyodorov, survived, luckily for them. And so that might be one of the reasons too. And they simply didn't know about this pre-war writings. So yeah, it's curious. I think it's one of the, and then maybe when they started translating them after the fact, it seemed, oh yeah, we'd already done that. So, right. So I don't know, but yes, it's one of the mysteries I haven't really solved.
Could I ask a quick question just related? Because I was thinking about the 1919 text, and that's the Gumilyov was Akhmatova's husband, right? Nikolai. He was shot or killed around then, 1919 or so. 21. And I wondered if if those texts got lost for a while in Soviet Russia, whether how acceptable that kind of text was after his death and after.
Well, that's what's interesting, and I tried to trace in the introduction to Fyodorov's Introduction to Translation Theory, which I titled How to Read Soviet Translation Theory, because I think some people are put off by some of the political, maybe rhetoric in it. But many of those ideas survived. Of course, you're right. In 1919, we had Principles of Literary Translation, expanded edition in 1920, where they added drama translation. So they already had a tripartite approach, poetry, prose, drama. The drama chapter was written by Batsushkov, who was a scholar of world literature at the University of St. Petersburg, quite sophisticated, and in fact, introduction to the 1920 talks about how a translation is affected by the relationship between the source and target culture. So if the target culture feels itself superior to the source, right, he doesn't call it domesticating, but and so on. So yes, Gumilyov is executed the next year as a monarchist. Batsushkov dies of starvation. So that couldn't be published again in that form. And so Chukovsky takes his writings, expands it, and co-authors a work in 1930 with a very young Andrei Fyodorov called The Art of Translation. And that Fyodorov's contribution is quite interesting because he studied under Yuri Tynyanov, the great Russian formalist who collaborated with Jakobson, of course. And that is the purest distillation of Russian formalist thought in translation theory anywhere in the world. He had to back away from that a bit in later works because it was so, in a sense, apolitical. He doesn't use the word Soviet once in that work. So yeah, it's a very complex history. But the influence of the formalists was central, and it remained. They had to maneuver a bit, but that central formalist precept that form and content are inseparable remains central to Soviet translation theory. And I would note that Jakobson, under the influence of the Cold War, backs away from that in his 1959 essay, right? Literary translation, he cordons off at the end and calls it creative transposition. So as if it's not translation, it's something else. And that's where form and content are connected inseparably. And the rest of it, which is often seen as his statement of total translatability, is predicated on the notion that we can extract the content from the form. Soviets didn't buy that. So again, yeah, the comparison is interesting too, because for Jakobson, I don't think that's an advance in his thinking. I think it's a capitulation to Cold War notions of science and so on.
Okay, thank you. There are two questions and comments which I chose in a sort of chronological order because they are quite different. The first one is by Sherry Simon, and I'll read it. The idea that intellectual traditions are forged through translation is compelling, that if translations do not happen at the right time, they do not exist. the Soviet example makes us imagine that all the many ideas that we've missed, especially from the South, could there be a plan to recoup these traditions?
Yes, and as I said, both the journal feature translation studies in translation and the book series at Routledge are meant to focus on work from the Global South, especially. And we cast a very wide net, because one of the reasons, or one of the ways that you exclude things is by having a very narrow definition of theory. And so I also started to look at how people defined the theory. And of course, they're very loose, but something that, it's this rigorous, and so on. So we cast a very wide net. Any kind of writings on translation, it could be essayistic, could be the introductions to that we would consider. We're very open to works from, especially from the Global South, that I think will really revolutionize the way we conceive our collective past. I mean, I was always struck by the fact that, people will cite Nabokov's literal translation or thick translation, but Lu Xun, the Chinese translator and theorist who developed this notion of hard translation, we don't cite that, or it's much less cited, even though it came first, right? So again, there's a lot of work we can do, but again, the role of translation is huge. And also this idea, by investing in translation, we're also saying, to be part of this conversation, you do not have to write in English. We will help with make our effort to help that work become part of a bigger conversation.
And there is another question, and it's by Christy Merrill. And she says, I have a very nerdy question about Heinz and Voigt's translation into English of the Benjamin task of translation of the translator essay that was published in the journal Holmes Edited, I believe. My advisory, Daniel Weisbord, always encouraged us to cite that one, and I see included that in his Oxford Reader on Translation Theory and Practice. How does this translation fit into your rethinking of our complex legacies?
Yeah, no, that's a great nerdy question. Yes, and of course, the whole idea of retranslations as a way to give new life to the conversation. I had a colleague in German who always complained about the translation, and she was always said she was going to create a new translation, and I can't understand all of her critique, but yes, there's certainly room for new translations. But again, I think my point was more that it could be situated in the German translation discourse of the late 19th, early 20th century, which it often isn't. Again, it's seen as this complete outlier. And that's a tradition that has been thoroughly ignored. And in fact, I would, when I came across these things, I would go to German colleagues in translation studies and say, do you know this work? Hadn't been presented with it either. So having these discussions through the translations and about these translations, I think is hugely productive. And I think that's one of the great contributions of Barbara Cassin's work, is that, the translations themselves are part of our translation thinking and part of our philosophizing about translation in and of themselves, which is my non-answer to your question. I'm sorry.
And then there is another sort of inverted commas general question, and I think it's for both of you, and it's by Vinita. How would you distinguish between appropriation and dissemination of knowledge while dealing with literary translations?
I don't know if you want me to answer that, Brian. I think what's really interesting is this whole, I'm editing a chapter on so-called bad translation, which I like that term, and how we can use bad translations to to read translations, right? That not just to go, well, this has been culturally appropriated, it's wrong, and it's kind of ideological. And that may be so, that may be true. But I think it's there's a time and space to kind of look at these translations and think about flag appropriation, think about appropriation, because every time we think about a translation, we have to think about its context. You know, it's not just airy-fairy out there in the ether, right? You know, that it's connected to someone's choices, to their material context, to what they're reading, what they're thinking about, to the demands of their public, right, or their domestic audience. And I think that's what makes translation so interesting to read, as certainly as a literary scholar or any kind of a history scholar, whatever, you know, is that you can't just take the text for what it is, right? You have to think about, you know, who translated it, why they were translating. And that opens up all these questions about how we contextualize any text, and what our ethics are as a reader, you know, what we should come to a text knowing, and what the ethics of the translator as reader are too. So I think there's, you know, I think in some senses all translations are appropriations because they're going through someone else's subjectivity at a certain time in a certain place. But that itself, I think, is interesting as a kind of hermeneutic tool, as a kind of exegetical tool. Brian.
Yeah, I'd also say a collaborative translation is a great approach. Those conversations will really inform the translation. And then paying really, really close attention to the key concepts and terms. So I had accepted the translation of the Russian term adekvatny as adequate. And it was regularly translated as such. And it appeared in the early 20 writings from, but then I started seeing structures, formulations that didn't align with our English Anglophone meaning of adequate, which means minimally sufficient for a purpose. So you would say, for example, in a work on linguistics, they said the signifier is not adekvatny to the signified. So it meant corresponding, perfectly corresponding. So the meaning was quite different. So, you know, I had to insist on translating it as either fully corresponding or as adekvatny, to make clear that this, you know, and a lot of that, especially when you're translating from languages with a lot of shared roots, the temptation to do something literal is there, and you have to be very, very careful. And even the word literature in Russian is used differently from English, because they refer to what we call literature, high literature, as artistic literature. So literature all by itself just means writing. And so, you know, we see that in some limited usage in English, like the literature review in a scholarly work. But otherwise, when we use literature alone, it means high literature. Russian, it's not that way. And so there was a lot of confusion in some of the translations. So, I mean, the translation, you have to spend the time isolating the key concepts and doing the research necessary. I mean, yeah.
Thank you, thank you. And then again, there is another question by Ying-Mei Liu from China. And it says, Dr. Baer, what are the differences between translation theory and translation thoughts? Some scholars think China does not have translation theory and only has translation thoughts because they think the thoughts are not systematic.
Right. I mean, that's what I was talking about before. I mean, we create a major exclusion when we adopt a very narrow understanding of what constitutes theory. And again, as I started to look and see how do they define theory, the definitions are quite loose. And how do we say something is systematic? At what point does it reach a sufficient level of systematicity? And so I don't know that necessarily we need that. And so the Russians actually, to their credit, have used translation thinking or translation thought, the history of Western translation thought. And so, yeah, I think theory might also be a kind of Cold War shibboleth.
I think just to add to that, I think this idea of theory, it is, I think, very much Cold War and very much of kind of the French theory and German theory post-war, you know, that certainly in literature, I know I keep coming back to my field, but, you know, that's when we think of theory, that's what we think of. That's how we're trained as scholars. And that's blinded us, I think, in some ways to thinking about, you know, and I would include even not only translation thinking, but things like translatorial prefaces and stuff that are often just, you know, wonderfully insightful, not only on that particular author, but also on kind of thinking about translation as a whole.
Okay, there's a question by Siri. So thank you, Brian and Michelle. Could you say something more on archives which might reframe the dominating history of TS, translation studies?
Yeah. Michelle, you've been writing about archives. Maybe you want to start on this one.
I have been writing about archives. Almost tired of it. Archives are so important. I think it's something that's been surprisingly neglected. And partly because I think they haven't been, translator archives haven't been, even by translators themselves, haven't been regarded as important. I talked to a translator who's translating Václav Havel's work, and I said to her, "You've got to leave your stuff to an archive." And she's like, "Really? Who'd be interested?" And it just made me want to go crazy. I was like, "No, you've got to promise me you're going to send it somewhere." And I think I would say to younger scholars, there's a wealth of information out there, maybe not under the translator's name, but certainly in authors' archives, in the archives of publishers, and so on. And it's such an amazing amount of information about practice, but also about the kind of network of agents involved in translation. You know, we tend to almost talk about, well, what are the translator's choices when they're, you know, we look at the product essentially. We're looking at what they did with the text and we make our assumptions. But once you go into the archive, you suddenly see that there are all these pressures on them. An editor might have a different idea. They're thinking about the kind of trying to sell the literature and so on. And there are these wonderful, it just gives you a kind of sense of a more holistic sense of the translator. I would say in the States, there's been a positive development in that Brian Mitchell, who's a famous translator here of German literature, of Günter Grass and Kafka, he set up in the Lilly Library an archive of translator archives, and he's got you know, even contemporary translators to promise to give him the archives of their work there, so that if you're thinking of doing any research, that's a great place. It's at Indiana Bloomington, the Lilly Library, and it's just a wonderful kind of resource for us as a field. But I would say to anyone out there that archives are just, I think there's potentially a ton of research still to be done, and a ton of thinking to be done about what archives mean to us theoretically, you know, how we might theorize using them. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I agree. I would.
Sorry.
Yeah, that it's related to the point I made about Lotman's idea about history, that, you know, when we write it from the with hindsight, it looks inevitable. And the same thing when we're only looking at the surface of the translation, we think all these decisions were, yes, often people assume it was one person who made them, but also that they were inevitable. And so the archive, just like criticism too, gives us a much more dynamic picture of the creative process and all that went into thinking and all the, you know, could have behind the, so yeah, I think it's a very rich, but also, you know, the archives that show government intervention and all that. So alongside the individual translator archives are going to present us with a much more nuanced understanding of translation, especially in the post-war period.
And there is a question coming from Cobus Murray, and it says, does the miracle, inverted commas, of translation presupposes the evil of multilingualism? Put differently, are translation studies scholars ardent supporters of multilingualism in order to position themselves in the miracle work, as the miracle workers? Shall I reread it? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll read it again. Does the miracle of translation presupposes the evil of multilingualism? Miracle and evil are inverted commas. Put differently, are translation studies scholars ardent supporters of multilingualism in order to position themselves as the miracle workers?
I mean, if I'll just start and say, kind of the way I come at this question is I think we can use, yes, of course, translation can be used, can be framed in a way that assumes the monolingualism of the addressee, as Sakai said, and in that way that reifies, as we say, the ontology of the nation state, of the monolingual nation state, but it doesn't have to do that. We can adopt different translation practices. And we also have to also not glorify. Sometimes I think there's this ideal multilingual migrant, which sometimes risks ignoring the very different plight of migrants who don't have the dominant language when they migrate. And this question of translation services and interpreting services for them becomes vital. And this has already become politicized with the rise of ethno-nationalism. So I don't know if people, the very first action the Trump administration took the day he took office was to remove the Spanish translation from the White House website. And there are also people in Great Britain. I think there was an undersecretary, his name was Eric Pickles, who was arguing that translation services hindered people's learning of English, which again, we know is not true. So I would say it differently. I would say we shouldn't be seduced by the miracle of multilingualism to think that translation is no longer necessary or doesn't have a role to play. Michelle?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think also, the pandemic brought that up really quickly here in New York. One of the worst hit hospitals was in Elmhurst, Queens, not far from where my husband grew up, in fact. But it's one of the most multilingual areas, even of New York, where I think 2/3 of people in New York have not been born in the States, or a third. It's a huge amount of number. And they had a real problem getting translators into the hospital when they were trying to deal with people coming in with COVID. And I think that speaks to the practical realities, whatever the Trump administration was trying to do with taking down the Spanish, et cetera, and trying to talk about it. In fact, the reality on the ground is that it's a highly multilingual country. And I think also, maybe this isn't related, but I think that we do tend to lionize ourselves as translation scholars and see ourselves as, again, and I think this speaks to exactly what Brian's getting at, to bring it back to the article, that we see ourselves as bringing these forgotten histories forward, that we're bringing this wonderful kind of multilingual world into people's purview. And I think we have to be a bit skeptical of that. I think we have to think about, just like any explorer going into another nation, that you're changing what you're doing when you take part in it, and I think that there has to be some kind of skepticism about this kind of valedictory notion of what translation studies is and what we do as translation studies scholars, perhaps.
I think we have a final question, and it's by Scott Williams. To what extent do you think traditional, again, inverted commas, translation theory adequately addresses interpreting, subtitling, and other modes of translation? That's the question.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we look at Venuti's latest book on contra-instrumentalism, he would say they don't very well. Yeah, I don't know, Michelle, if you want to take a shot at that one.
I think there's been a growth, in kind of, I think certainly in the 90s when I'm going back on, it's like my history tour here, but, I think it was very much kind of literary translation studies being applied to interpreting and so on. But I think now, we've built up a field of kind of theoretical writing specifically on screen translation, cognitive translation, and so on. There's still areas I think that are growing. And so I think, having said that, I think at the root we have these kind of similar connections. that may be not a bad thing in some ways, because I mean, something I love about translation studies conferences where you can meet someone who's doing cognitive or interpreting or whatever, and you still have this kind of somewhat common theoretical language. Now that may be something we'll have to overthrow if we're rethinking and re-envisioning what our theoretical history is. But I think in some ways I quite like that little connection because it brings me into other spaces, and there's a slight common tongue, but I don't know if that's too...
But I think at the same time, we often make assumptions about subtitling practices that maybe are specifically Western or specific to the global North. I gave an example in a class of that movie, from the movie The Pianist, where some parts of it were in German, and a Nazi officer asks the pianist what his name is, and he says, Spielmann. And the response, oh, that's a good name for a piano player, right? And I thought, well, people who don't know German and the Spielen means to play won't get the pun. And one of my Arabic students says, oh, in the Arabic film, they put square brackets and they explain the play on words. So I thought, okay, there's a lot we don't know about other traditions. And now with fans and things, yeah, it's a very, very dynamic field.
Well, I think that we finished our question and answer session, and I sort of thank you personally, because I think you were forced to jump from one topic to the other, and it was quite difficult, but it was difficult for me to sort of put all the questions in a sort of logic order, even because they arrived at different times. So I couldn't predict what would come next. So thank you for jumping into the topic. Thank you. So I think that we are perfectly on time. Is 5:15. Am I correct, Salvatore? Is that
That's right. I just popped in to say that the session is now officially over. There's going to be a bit of a break now for about 15 minutes before the next conversation starts. I wanted to personally thank Brian and Michelle for their conversation, also for being so generous in their answers. Just a quick reminder to all of the attendees, please ask your questions during the conversations. There are absolutely no problems. Actually, we would prefer it if you asked questions during the conversation. Okay, so thank you all very, very much. Monica, I think, is about to put the slide up.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Michelle. Bye,
Bye.
Brian.
Bye.
Bye.